I arrived before the rain, expecting the scent of camphor and chai to float up from the stairwell, expecting the hum of my mother's old harmonium to still hang in the air like a kindness that refused to leave. Instead, my key turned on a void. The door breathed out dust and silence. Where my drafting table once leaned, there was a pale rectangle of unsunned paint, where our wedding photograph used to judge me from the wall. Only 2 nail heads remained, like punctuation at the end of an unfinished sentence. The cupboards yawned. The balcony door whistled. In the kitchen, a single receipt curled like a dead leaf near the drain. They hadn't just sold things. They had subtracted the weight of my life and left the outline. I walked through it, tracing ghosts with my fingers, gathering the inventory of absence, learning the shape of betrayal by fingertip. Then I saw it, small and brazen on the sill, a brass key they'd missed, cool as a promise in my palm. Downstairs, the guard's register had my name crossed out with a felt-tip slash, a date scrawled beside it like a verdict. The story came in polite shrugs. Notices pinned while I was abroad, a cousin vouching, a wife coordinating, all very proper. On my phone, the auction site showed thumbnails of my life, each tagged with lot numbers and estimates, my mother's embroidered shawl reduced to 6 lines of copy, and a reserve price. I scrolled until the images blurred and the copy bled. Anger would have been easier, but anger would only feed the furnace that warmed them. I pocketed the brass key and took a photograph of the register, then of the elevator camera, then of my own hand. Habits of a designer cataloging failures. I told myself, count first, strike later. Make the arithmetic whole. Back in the stairwell, my cousin's name echoed, the syllables of trust gone threadbare. Tariq had always known where the papers slept, which drawer held stamps, and which elder would answer a favor with a proverb. If he had opened the door to them, then the story of us was written in receipts. I called, let it ring until the sound felt like a pencil scoring a page, then hung up. A voice message arrived from Sana, dressed in courtesy. Hope you're well. We had to act quickly. You were unreachable. I'll explain. The words paced the cage of my chest. Careful, measured, almost rehearsed. I scrolled farther. A lawyer's email. Tidy. Exact. Nouning my life into inventory. The key pressed a circle in my palm. I thought of my mother telling me that proof is patience made visible. The apartment had one last drawer they'd missed. Thin as a whisper, built under the window ledge, painted shut since my mother's first winter here. I pried it open with a butter knife and found the smallness of her. 2 folded receipts, a transit card, a note written on the back of an envelope instructing me to pay the teacher before I'd, signed with a flourish that made the E linger. Her handwriting leaned right, as if hurrying to keep up with its own heart. The note smelled faintly of attar. I sat on the floor and read it until the paper warmed in my hands and the room steadied. Her voice returned, not as a ghost, but as a method. Keep the paper, follow the numbers, forgive only after the sums are true. The key clicked against the envelope like a metronome keeping time. Night put the city into a soft electric prayer. I walked to the sea, to the long concrete lip of Clifton, where boys sold tea in paper cups and couples rehearsed futures in whispers. The brass key weighed like a sentence waiting for its verb. I sat on the seawall, let a cheap cup burn my palms, and opened a clean page on my phone. Names, dates, sums, and the first principles my mother taught me. Evidence before emotion, process before punishment, justice without spectacle. They had sold everything I owned, but the freedom of this moment was that ownership could move both ways. Wind lifted spray up to my lips and salted the plan forming there. I would not argue in rooms where favors were currency. I would buy the rooms. I would audit the heart from the ledger, and then decide what mercy cost. The storage locker was the kind of place where forgotten seasons went to calcify. Corrugated corridors, low humming lights, the smell of cardboard and old tape. The brass key found its throat on the third try, and the door slid up with a cough. Inside, my mother's ledgers, wrapped in cloth, stitched with her initials, receipts clipped by rusted bulldog jaws, blue folders labeled in a steady hand, an accountant's quiet cathedral. I sat cross-legged on the concrete and opened the books as if unsealing a lung. Margins thick with her tidy cautions, small arrows guiding future eyes. Mine now. Tariq's name emerged in graphite, then in ink, then in transfers that knotted into dates I remembered as family dinners. I let the anger pass over me like a wave and kept reading. Numbers were not rage. They were rails. I photographed, cataloged, and sent the first batch to Mihak with a single line. Start the tree. Follow every branch. Mihak answered in 3 rings, the calm I needed, coded into her hello. She didn't ask if I was all right. She asked what format the files were in. That was her way of offering a hand without making me explain the wound. We mapped the first constellation. Auction house to liquidation firm to a micro-lender feeding Rafi's flips. All wrapped in a holding company that wore a cheerful name like a mask. She built me a dashboard with quiet precision, columns that could carry the weight of our intent. Distressed paper is a language, she said, and they've been speaking it badly. I listened to the rain lean harder into the locker roof and imagined Sana approving invoices she didn't read, Rafi pouring whiskey onto a stack of ayus and calling it courage, Tariq rehearsing platitudes. I told Mihak we would buy their words back, letter by letter, until the sentences belonged to us. Buying shadows required courtesy and silence. Through an intermediary fund with an innocuous name, we began bidding on tranches of delinquent notes no one believed in anymore. The sellers talked in discounts and recoveries. I spoke in patience. Each signature was a small theft of gravity from the men who had taken mine. Between calls, I listened to my mother's old voice notes, reminders to her staff about reconciliations, about never rushing a count when someone else's dignity sat inside the numbers. Her ethics settled the tremor in my hands. When the first packet cleared, Mihak sent a single line. Effective tomorrow, you are their lender of record. I thought of Rafi's laughter at the auction, of Sana's careful captions, of Tariq's handshake politics. The rain on the roof thinned to a patter, like a pencil tapping a desk. It sounded for a moment like agreement. At dawn, we walked the bazaar where Rafi's crews liked to source vintage fixtures at new money prices. I wasn't there to trail him. I was there to feel the tempo of his debts in the metal and wood he adored. Shops yawning open, shutters rattling like drums, tea arriving in chipped cups, men telling yesterday's gossip as if it were a national anthem. Mihak quizzed a vendor about supplier credit and smiled with courtroom softness when the man bragged about cashing Rafi's post-dated checks early. The map in my head redrew itself. Not just nodes and lines, but faces and afternoons, and the thickness of envelopes. Debt, I realized, was architecture. It shaped how people stood in a room. When a notice of audit left our inbox that morning, I imagined it flying like a paper kite from a rooftop, pretty, until the string pulled. By night's end, the dashboard glowed with a geometry that even fatigue couldn't blur. 3 defaults due within weeks. 1 permit contingent on a safety audit. An insurance policy with a clause that read like a fuse. Mihak circled items that could be triggered without spectacle, requests any responsible lender would make. I wrote the letters myself, their tone cordial as rain. In the margins, I copied my mother's habit of leaving small mercies. A deadline extended if truth arrived. A fee waived if an apology was signed on letterhead. Mercy, I kept reminding myself, is not weakness. It is the shape of strength after the blow lands. Before we shut the laptops, Mihak asked what I wanted back once the ledger balanced. I said only the harmonium. and a future where our names didn't require receipts to be forgiven. The city exhaled. Morning was already pinking the edges. The auction hall smelled of lacquer and old pride, a long room dressed in borrowed glamour, where the presentable poor and the performatively rich pretended to be cousins. I took a seat near the back, a student among syllabus pages of my own life. Lot numbers marched across a screen, the drafting table reduced to invoice geometry, the shawl demoted to fabric and stitch, my mother's enamel cups called vintage kitchenware. A gloved man lifted each piece, as if blessing it. Before exile, gavel taps made tidy griefs of untidy years. I kept my hands in my pockets and my heart at a low idle. Rafi arrived late. Swagger parceled in perfume and applause. Sana composed in a cream salwar that photographed well, Tariq whispering to a clerk, who mistook his tremor for authority. When the harmonium appeared and the room leaned in, I did not. I let the number climb from indifferent to obscene, and then I let it go. Bait must look like surrender. By noon, the theater had done its work. Strangers now owned the surface of my days. Outside, rain rethreaded the city, and the auction crowd dissolved into umbrellas and after-lunch boasts. I stood under the awning and watched my phone bloom with confirmations, the way a storm blooms with lightning. Notices served, audits scheduled, covenants politely reminded. The language was friendly, but flint-edged. Mayhak's timing braided with mine. When Rafi lifted a glass somewhere, an email was lifting clauses. When Sana posted a victory caption, a courier was posting an envelope through a shutter. I felt the strange mercy of process, how it refused to shout. Behind it, my mother's ledgers hummed like a chorus keeping pitch. I checked the timestamp on the harmonium's sale and wrote it down, not because it was lost, but because it had joined a different kind of inventory. The list of things I would redeem last. Rafi chose a rooftop bar to baptize his win, the kind with a grass wall for photographs and a view designed to make men believe they were taller than their debts. He held court at a table planted with bottles, laughter choreographed in crescendos. I arrived 2 floors below, where the property manager kept a noiseless office and a file labeled with the building's spine. The lease assignments were sleeping there, stamped and dated, my fund's name nested in clauses like a hidden chorus. I signed a maintenance request with trivial authority, a lift calibration, just to feel the building recognize my signature. Above, their music trembled through the ductwork, a pulse of borrowed triumph. Ownership, I thought, is not a selfie. It's a signature in a room no one photographs. When I stepped back into the elevator, I caught my face in the steel. Calm, almost kind. A man rehearsing the sound of restraint. Mihak called from a taxi, signal hiccuping with every flyover. "We can pull the audit triggers clean," she said. "But remember the slope once we start. Gravity helps." I pictured her not as a voice, but as a metronome, keeping vengeance from rushing the tempo. She had annotated the letters with exits, restitution schedules, training requirements for staff, options to convert embarrassment into reform. I added a clause for the foundation, percentages that would flow not to me but to classrooms that hungered for chalk. My mother would approve the arithmetic, if not the method. The temptation to humiliate them felt like a fever breaking. The cooler thought was to ask for signatures that would last longer than shame. "You can still choose the tone," Mehak said as the line crackled. I looked toward the sea where the sky was ironed flat and said, "Make it polite. Let the paper do the talking." At midnight I walked the perimeter of my old neighborhood, past balconies where laundry swung like small parliaments and dogs negotiated treaties with the moon. The apartment's windows were dark. The outline of the drafting table still haunted the wall like a watermark I could see from the street. I thought of Sana's careful poise, Rafi's curated daring, Tariq's hands praying when he lied. The notices would be waking in their inboxes now, civil and unyielding. I did not want their ruin. I wanted proof to grow roots in public soil. Tomorrow would begin with inspections and end with signatures or with refusals that would cost what refusals cost. I placed the brass key on my tongue for a childish second, tasting metal, memory, resolve. Then I pocketed it, said my mother's name under my breath, and let the city's wet hush close around the choice I had already made. Morning arrived shaped like a checklist. The first inspection at Cena's boutique unfolded with the courtesy of a scalpel. Clipboards, barcode scanners, polite questions that left no corners to hide in. I stood across the street with a paper cup and let the process be my presence. Inside, a manager tried to smile the auditors into softness while inventory numbers told a colder story. Consignments recorded twice, stock routed through a promotional partner that existed only as a Gmail address, invoices. Approved at 2 a.m. with identical typos. Mihak texted updates in unadorned lines. Counts, variances, signatures. Every number a rung down from the image Sana sold to her followers. I remembered my mother recalculating a donor list by hand before accepting a pledge, grumbling that trust is not a discount. When Sana finally stepped outside, meeting the sun as if it had accused her, I turned away and wrote the next request, tender as a warning. Rafi's flagship site wore its ambition like scaffolding, steel ribs, netted edges. Cranes posed like insects, drinking from concrete. The compliance team arrived with tape measures and grins that didn't need to be unkind. The permit clock, it turned out, had skipped beats that paperwork could hear. Safety logs copied forward. Vendor certifications expired. An elevator test bypassed and signed by a man who'd moved to Muscat 2 years ago. Rafi strode in late, fragrant, incredulous at the audacity of rules. His foreman sucked his teeth and looked at the ground. I walked the perimeter with a borrowed hard hat and a silence that registered on clipboards as authority. Mihak's email went out at noon. Temporary suspension, rectification plan attached, bond drawdown possible. The crane stilled like a held breath. It would have been easy to feel triumphant. Instead, I counted the workers smoking by the gate and calculated a way to keep them paid while the owners learned humility. Tariq tried to outpace paper with culture. TA offered, titles invoked. A proverb about cousins being the first bank. But the elders he had trusted for cover now held our printed exhibits, and the proverbs bent under the weight of signatures. In the family drawing room, ceiling fans murmured above rugs that remembered happier arguments. I arrived last and kept to the threshold while the accountant, an auntie in bifocals, read aloud the account of a consultancy fee that had circled from charity funds to Tariq's shell and back into a cousin's wedding stage. He began with indignation and ended with a chair that found his hands like a confession booth. I did not ask for apology. I asked for a written admission, repayment schedule, and his agreement to sit before the foundation's board and describe exactly how temptation dresses in family colors. He nodded once, a man watching his own exit assemble from verbs. Online, the story began to molt. A blog post with too much perfume accused. A defense heavy with adjectives replied. Screenshots lined up like soldiers with flags. The algorithm loved the fight more than the facts. Mihak drafted a single statement for the foundation. Unshowy, audited, dates spelled in full. As our only public voice, I declined interviews and answered questions with letters on letterhead. In private, suppliers called to whisper what they'd always known but had never had a safe place to say. Receipts slid beneath our door like folded birds. I felt a heat rise that wasn't pride so much as relief. The world could be nudged by proof if you stacked it carefully and let it bear its own weight. At dusk, I passed the boutique again. The shutters were half down, the ring light off. In the glass, my reflection looked like a man practicing a language older than outrage. The midpoint is not a line. It is a room where you decide which door you will be able to live with later. I laid our options on the conference table like instruments, shut them down and harvest salvage or insist on restitution that taught them to count without stealing. Mayhack argued for outcomes that survived the news cycle. I added a clause that sent a percentage of recovered value to the foundation in perpetuity, turning shame into chalk and salaries. We softened deadlines for employees and hardened them for owners. When the documents were ready, I read them aloud in an empty office, hearing my mother's patience in the cadence. Outside, rain returned in a thin, silvery scrim, and the city blurred into a single soft shape. I felt the anger recede into the shape of resolve. Mercy would not erase what happened. It would define what happened next. The mosque courtyard held its morning like a bowl. Thin sun caught in marble veins. The murmurs of ablution dissolving into sparrows. Tariq arrived with the rehearsed heaviness of a man who hoped posture could outvote paper. I didn't sit. I laid the restitution schedule between us, the way doctors lay x-rays. No accusation, only anatomy. He started with family grammar, the proverbs he keeps in his sleeve for when numbers hard. I let them pass like weather. I recited dates, transfers, vendor codes, the trail from the foundation's petty cash to a cousin's wedding canopy strung with borrowed lights. His mouth kept forming the word just, as if it could turn theft into errand. When he asked what I wanted, I told him, confession on letterhead, repayments pinned to the calendar, and a chair before the board where he would teach how this happens. He closed his eyes, and I watched shame find a place to sit. Sana's boutique slept behind its shutters, the metal rib cage half lowered, a string of dead fairy lights drooping like tired apologies. She unlocked slowly, as if the lock might vote with me and refuse. Inside, the ring light remained off. Daylight made no promises to glass. I told her she hadn't stolen inventory. She'd stolen confidence. The public's, her staff's, mine. Her face didn't crumble. It organized itself, as if reshuffling expressions could reorder truth. I offered her the exits, sign the amended statements, return the double-booked consignments, commit a standing percentage to the foundation under her name. You want my apology with interest, she said, not unkindly. I said I wanted her math to be honest when no one was looking. Silence went long. We both stared at a mannequin with pins still in its hem. She nodded once, as if agreeing with the dress, and asked for a pen that didn't blur. Rafi preferred altitudes where consequences looked smaller. The rooftop was slick with afternoon rain. The city pressed flat under a sheet of tin sky. He laughed when he saw me, a laugh built for witnesses, and gestured at the cranes as if they were vowels of his name. I told him the permit suspensions weren't personal. Neither was gravity. He tried to buy time with theater. Boasts that tasted like old ice. Threats tenderized by repetition. I opened my folder to the lease assignments, the bond drawdown notices, the emails he hadn't read. The laughter frayed, revealing wires. You want my empire, he said. I said I wanted his receipts to speak a language that didn't lie. He stepped close enough to smell the cologne, and I let the quiet say the rest. The lenders he owed were me. Rain started again, a soft fist of water on steel. He looked up, finally measuring the weather. By evening, the smear bloomed. Anonymous accounts accused me of laundering grief into power. A doctored screenshot married my name to a bribe. I answered with instruments, not volume. Mihawk cued the recordings, each call notarized into precision. Emails played like scales. Timestamps aligned with courier slips. The first post we released was plain. Dates in full. Rupee amounts without commas. The word, here, linked to evidence. The noise recoiled, then returned in tatters. I remembered my mother saying that lies sprint and truth walks, but truth has better shoes. At midnight, we posted the audit trail to the Foundation's site, tucked between lesson plans and donation receipts, in the place where children could find it by accident and learn what proof sounds like. The next mornings, silence felt less like defeat for them than like an invitation to change tense, from boasting to admitting, from hiding to totaling. The offers went out before dawn. Language careful as surgery, restitution as equation, training as prerequisite, public apology as hinge. I added a clause that let employees choose continuity over chaos. Suppliers would be paid from escrow we controlled. The foundation would receive a fixed percentage forever, regardless of who owned the sign on the door. Tariq signed first, his pen a slow oar through thick water. Sana arrived with her manager and a list of names she wanted to protect. We built them into the terms. Rafi sent a threat from his lawyer. I replied with calendars and cash flows and the quiet kindness of options. When the last envelope sealed, I felt something yield inside me that wasn't triumph. It was the sound of the ledger closing on the past without slamming. Outside, the city brightened, a shy choral, and I let the harmonium's absence remind me of what I'd still come to claim. The stamp fell like soft thunder. By noon, the registrar's seal had walked across Rafi's flagship deed, and the paper became a hinge the whole city could hear if it listened. There was no theater, only desks, dates, and a clerk with a bored pen. I watched signatures knit themselves into a transfer, and somewhere above us a crane idled, unsure whom to obey. Rafi's counsel called 3 times, a voice made of lacquer and threat, but the math had already chosen a direction. Mihak read the escrow confirmation without drama, because justice that needs applause is only fashion. The property would be sold before sundown to a buyer who respected permits and payroll. The proceeds, net of debts, would move into accounts that would never again be drunk into bravado. I felt the city breathe around the choice. Not relieved, not angry, just corrected, like a balance brought back to zero so a better sum might begin. Sana arrived in quiet clothes and left her voice at the threshold. The boutique was open but hushed, as if the mannequins understood what equity sounds like when it shifts owners without moving a shelf. We sat in the back office where ring lights go to sleep and invoices learn to blush. The transfer instrument was clinical, its verbs precise. Assign, convey, allocate. I spoke only to the paper, as if sparing us both. She read quickly, then slower, then paused on the clause that sent a perpetual share to the foundation under her own name. When she asked if that meant her apology would be read in classrooms, Mehak nodded. The pen didn't tremble when she signed, but her breathing did, the sound of a life-changing register without changing key. Outside, a customer rang the bell, and nobody answered. We finished the counter signatures and filed the copy in a blue folder that felt heavier than its weight. By evening, Tariq's phone had fewer names willing to answer it. The elders gathered again, not for spectacle, but for a kind of housekeeping that requires both tenderness and the ability to close a door. They did not shout. They audited. The restitution letterhead signed lived now in their minutes. The board chair placed it beside a ledger like a pairing of cause and cure. When his honorifics were gently rescinded, the room did not jeer. It sighed, the way a house sighs when a crooked frame is straightened. He took it with the sudden age that confession gives. I did not stay to watch his exit. I am not the architect of his shame. Outside, I answered a volunteer's question about textbook budgets, and felt the future tug at my sleeve with cleaner hands than the past. Mercy, I realized, doesn't erase consequence. It teaches it to speak in full sentences and to sit in the front row. The sale closed with the merciless precision of code. Funds cascaded through accounts in lines we had rehearsed. Creditors made whole, payroll protected, suppliers thanked with punctuality. The remainder moved as promised into the foundation's arteries, where it began to warm rooms that had never known central air. Mehak watched the dashboards the way a pilot watches weather, ready to adjust, unwilling to gloat. I signed disbursement orders and felt the strange lightness that comes when money stops being a mirror and becomes a tool. In the ledger, I wrote my mother's name once, not as a memorial, but as an internal control. A reminder to audit myself in seasons when nobody else will. Outside, the city glittered with ordinary purpose, buses leaning into corners, hawkers bargaining, a girl reading under a streetlight with a stubborn patience that felt like a heredity I'd finally chosen to honor. The harmonium came home on a quiet afternoon, carried by two careful hands, and a receipt that felt like a benediction. I met the courier at the door, and let the weight settle into the room, the way a returning word finds its place in a sentence. The wood still held a faint perfume of the places it had waited, the brass stops cool as coins in winter. I pressed one key and the apartment remembered how to breathe. Santa's message arrived an hour later, small and unadorned. I was afraid of being ordinary. I typed back the only arithmetic I trusted. There is enough in ordinary if you don't counterfeit it. In the evening, I took the instrument to the foundation hall where paint still smelled new. Children shuffled in. Curious, I placed my mother's name on the air, not with grief, but with balance. When the last note settled, I knew the ledger could close without any door slamming behind it. By morning, the city learned what the ledgers had been whispering. The lender behind their favorite facades wore my name in small print. Reporters called, microphones assembling like metal flowers outside doors I did not open. Our statement was a paragraph, not a parade. Terms honored, restitution active, payroll intact, the foundation endowed in perpetuity by percentages that would never trend. Rafi's counsel attempted a last flourish of volume, but the instruments had already played. Santa's boutique posted new hours and a link to the audit. Tariq asked for the right to speak before the board as a student, not a senior. It was less a triumph than a calibration. My mother's photograph on the office shelf seemed to soften at the edges, as if the air decided to carry her voice differently now. I declined interview slots and signed the filings that finished the work. Justice did not need my face, only my signature. Consequences arrived like weather. Gradual, then suddenly everywhere. Rafi stood in a meeting room he no longer owned and signed a confession of process, not guilt, because the former could be taught to others. He read each line aloud, a man translating himself into a language with fewer adjectives. Sana filmed nothing. She sat on a floor with her staff and planned a season of returns and literacy drives, not for optics, but because she had to learn how to breathe in public again. Tariq, older by a week and a decade, faced the foundation board with a ledger and a pointer and traced the roots of small thefts, naming temptation without theater. The room took notes. I did not feel clean. I felt accurate. The city moved past us, indifferent and vital, and that too felt like justice. Life continuing without our drama at its center. I made a map of returns, objects that remembered other hands better than mine. A carpenter's lamp went back to the widow who had given it to me when the studio opened. A set of enamel cups found their way to a cousin whose first chai I'd drunk from them. A photograph returned to the photographer, who captured a kindness I hadn't yet earned. With each handoff, the ledger in my head thinned. Not from loss, but from weight redistributed to where it belonged. I did not keep much. The harmonium, a sketchbook with my mother's margin notes, the brass key, now dulled by sweat into a talisman of arithmetic. Mercy looked like walking upstairs and ringing doorbells without a camera. I said, "Thank you," not as closure, but as an invoice paid in a currency older than cash. Doors closed behind me softly, the city folding the moments back into itself. Dawn came as paperwork and salt air. On the seawall, I signed the final discharges. Claims released, liens satisfied, covenants set to run like quiet rivers under our names. Mayhawk read each clause aloud, her voice low enough to keep the gulls unstartled. We sealed the envelopes and watched a fisherman push his boat against the morning, the labor beautiful, because it was exact. I thought about the shape of vengeance before it hardens, and how close I had come to choosing spectacle over structure. My mother's counsel, filtered through ledgers and years, had insisted on gentler tools that still cut true. "That's the last of it," Mihak said, and I wrote the date in my sketchbook beside a small drawing of the ocean. We sat there long enough to become background, and for once, the city let us be ordinary. A mercy I had not known I wanted. The foundation opened its doors to a line of shoes that looked like a census, scuffed school sandals, office heels, the dignified slippers of elders. I set the harmonium on the low stage and let the first chord name the room after my mother, but not like a shrine, like a workshop. Sana stood at the edge, eyes lifted, a promise signed and now being kept. Tariq stacked books without being asked, an apprentice to consequence. Rafi arrived late, hands empty for once, and took a seat in the second row, listening as if the sound might show him a better kind of height. Mayhak leaned against the back wall, a smile that understood the arithmetic of this moment. When the children began to read, the air thickened with a future we hadn't purchased so much as made possible. I closed the ledger, not with triumph, not with grief, with balance.